A young man with brown hair was tied to a cross, and discontented people around threw eggs at him. He claims to have superpowers, but not such as soaring above clouds, eyes lasers. He has the most useless power that no one would ever want for themselves. A red flag with the inscription "Death to Class F" is waving in the background. An angry crowd shouts, waving a red flag, and the main character does not understand why. The most pathetic superhero was in front of an angry crowd on the block because his superpower does not deserve such attention. A man with blue hair and dark glasses is sitting next to him, bound by tree branches. Another man with dark hair shouts his name Sangle. The main character tells him that a dark-haired guy named QX should not worry about him because he is not afraid of heights. However, QX refuses to listen to him and sets out to save him. Against the background of a scarlet sunset, a man in a white uniform appears, addressing the main character and accusing him of kidnapping the head of state, destroying the school building. Such acts of terrorism have plunged the country into chaos. The man turns to him and asks if he knows who the real culprit is. Sangle knows who planned these crimes, but doesn't answer the question. A man in uniform, addressing the people, began to outrageously exclaim that Sangle does not admit his guilt and continues to deny his involvement in these crimes. He asks the crowd not to be deceived by his appearance and claims that he has a video of the terrorists who carried out the attack. The man raises his hand. There is a remote control in it. He presses the switch and turns on the video recording. The screen shows the words "abduction of the president" and shows two young men, one of them in a purple hoodie, his face covered by a hood, and behind him is a second young man in pink glasses, a blue hat with the words "Happy Birthday" and brown hair. A young man in a blue hat holds up a sign that says they are a group of supervillains. It may be hard to believe, but last week they kidnapped the president of this country. In the background, a gray-haired, frightened man with duct tape taped over his mouth. A young man looks into the frame offering to guess who they are. Sangle recalls the events before the controversial video, when he was waiting for an interview for an intern position in a small company. The main character is visibly worried. A small sweat has appeared on his face. He is clutching a dark briefcase with his hands. He is dressed in a dark suit with a blue tie. Next to him sits a relaxed man in contrast to him, more informal clothes in the form of a jacket, t-shirt, glasses, and headphones with a hat. A man in a business suit and glasses bursts out of the door, shouting the main character's name and running up to him. The man turns out to be delighted with Sangle, asking him if he goes to the Hero Academy. The main character, after a little hesitation, replies that yes. The man, however, continues to push him, exclaiming that a gifted person like him would work for such a small company. Mega corporations would be very unhappy. A happy man pours him a cup of tea on the background of a plate with a large variety of fruits. Sangle asks, perplexed, what about the interview itself? In response, the man raises his thumb and holds a remote control in his hand, presses a button and plays the recording. Leadership Academy, the best school for superhumans in the whole country. Graduates of this academy are at the top of society, lending their talents to the best corporations and government agencies. Against the starry sky, there are four men in white uniforms, one of them with long blonde hair, followed by a man with short blonde hair, followed by a man with short green hair and glasses. The last of these four is a man with long dark hair. Sangle sits in a bit of disbelief at the man's speech. The man who hosted him continues to say that he is a big fan and it is a great honor for them to hire a Superman. Sangle continues to writhe uncertainly, clasping his hands together and replying that he is in F class. The man immediately freezes after his words and saws the main character out of the building. Sangle storms out of it in frustration. In the background, a lot of documents fly out after it. In the background, while the main character is lying crying on the ground, the man who just kicked him out of the building approaches Mr. Kim, the same man in the blue jacket, headphones and hat who was sitting next to Sangle, and tells him that he has been hired. While Sangle is lying on the ground, a dog runs up to him, sniffing at his briefcase. He is upset and indignant that this eccentric man, who didn't even take off his headphones, got a job, and doesn't understand what this person can do that he can't. While Sangle laments that he didn't get the job, the dog that sniffed the hero's briefcase grabs him and runs away. The main character tries to grab it, but does not have time. The owner of the dog orders her to immediately throw this dirty briefcase, lamenting a bad day and the fact that his briefcase was ruined by a dog. Because he just bought it, he is noticed by a young man with blue hair, glasses, and a musical instrument on his back. Obviously, he was amused by the situation, so he grins without saying anything to the main character. A young girl with short pink hair, wearing a school uniform and a sandwich with an egg in her mouth flies along the blue sky over ordinary people passing by with two other schoolchildren, a girl and a young man. She is late for something. The kids fly past a plump elderly man in a purple shirt with glasses and a newspaper in his hands. Next to him, unlike the elderly man, a little girl in a green dress is happy, raising her hands to the blue sky, exclaiming to the students of the Leadership Academy flying past them. Sangle walks past these same people on foot, and an elderly man points at him, spitting saliva from his mouth, and turns to him with displeasure, noting that these people from Academy need to give a scolding. Grandpa turns to the main character, calling him over, while the little girl tries to calm him down, asking him to stop. An elderly man notices a badge on the chest of the main character that says fan notes that this badge is not the same as the others. Grandpa and the little girl, sitting on a bench next to flower beds and green trees, begin to look at the main character in surprise. Sangle's eyes start to light up, numbers appear on his face, and other numbers appear above the head of the girl and the elderly man, indicating their year, month, and birthday. A little girl, clinging to her grandfather, looks scared and exclaims that she is scared. Nevertheless, the main character, not noticing the fear and bewilderment on their faces, claps his hands and happily notes that these two were born in August. His eyes and face shone with joy. Sangle continues to talk on an abstract topic, telling them that there is a great pastry shop nearby and the tables are booked for a month in advance. He also notes that they should try a cake from this pastry shop for their birthday. Grandpa and the little girl look at him in disbelief, not understanding what happened. The main character goes to the academy in upset feelings, complaining that he failed all the interviews. Other guys rush by next to him. One of them has the ability to fire. A flame is burning in his hand. Next to this fiery young man passes another guy with a purple glow who is looking at his phone. The guys follow the main character across the sports field, heading to the academy. It turns out that Sangle's ability isn't that exciting, as his superpower is that he can see people's birthdays. The background shows a typical superhero in a blue uniform with a red cape on the back and with his hand raised to the sky. The appearance of superhumans in this world happened suddenly. According to research, strong experiences experienced during adolescence can develop a corresponding superpower in a person. The same portrayed classic superhero in a school uniform and carrying a briefcase on his back walks past an alley where a gunman threatens an elderly, frightened grandmother with a gun. He immediately rushes to help, punishing the bandit and saving an elderly woman. Granny happily exclaims that he is her hero. The more mundane a person's experience, the more mundane the superpower. Next, the same depicted superhero is defeated. Sangle, who has flown far away in his thoughts, bumps into a tall young man with dark short hair wearing a black t-shirt and a white shirt. He looks formidable, tall and big, and is obviously displeased that Sangle bumped into him. The people around them who notice this situation are horrified, worried about what will happen to Sangle next. Upon seeing this situation, two students, a young girl with long brown hair and a young man with dark short hair, say that this healthy guy who was hit by Sangle is named Kahyuk-woo and he is in a class. Kahyuk-woo glares at Sangle, his brows furrowed, and there's a discontented aura around him. Sangle looks back at him in disbelief and the numbers appear on his face again. People watching this situation, worried, begin to think about whether to call them an ambulance. Kahyuk-woo continues to look more and more menacingly at Sangle, and thanks to his ability to see other people's birthdays, he notices that the big guy in front of him has a birthday today. Sangle happily claps a firecracker to congratulate Kyuek on his birthday. He begins to tell him more about his ability, that he can see other people's birthdays, so he always carries crackers and gifts just for such occasions. Talking about his ability, he looks inspired and happy. Sangle gives him a small gift in a small box with flowers, which turns out to be a small keychain. Kahyuk-woo, however, is not particularly thrilled and looks even more annoyed. The aura around him thickens, taking on black and red hues. Despite being presented with a gift, the boy is not particularly thrilled, angry that Sangle is holding his hand. He immediately jumps away from him, apologizing for forgetting himself and not letting go of his hand in time. Surprised by this situation, other students begin to discuss it. Two guys, a blonde and a brunette, start to discuss how Kahyuk looked very angry and take Sangle's gesture as if an F-class student was trying to suck up to an A-class student, saying that F-class students are losers, saying that this is always the case. Against the backdrop of a sports field and greenery in the distance, the rest of the students start giggling behind the main character's back. Sangle hears everything and clutches the strap of his briefcase, looking a little confused. As he walks along the crowd at school, while other students whisper and laugh at him, he reflects that this is the life of an F-class student. They are treated like trash, and that this is not really surprising because not all super people are equal. Sangle stands on a red F away from the other two students, who are happy and socializing with each other. Their uniforms are marked with the letter of the class. The student council understood perfectly well, so they were rounded up and quarantined in a classroom reserved for the dregs of the school, too pathetic to be called superhumans. In the background, the entrance to the F class. Still a small Sangle, happy, opens the doors to the classroom and sees in front of him students who are sleeping, playing on the phone, skipping lessons. On the classroom table sits the teacher who is tossing a smoldering cigarette butt in his hand, completely oblivious to his class and the students around him. The class looks dirty and gloomy, which the hero immediately pays attention to. This class is a garbage dump. Sullen students who are wasting their time have fun with their superpowers, which neither teachers nor friends pay attention to. Two students are asleep, one of them wrapped in a blanket and with a pillow under her neck is dozing on a chair. Another student, a young man in a red shirt, is resting next to her. Not far from them is another student of the class who is passionate about the phone. Sangul, seeing this picture, immediately loses heart. His face shows surprise and sadness. He immediately gets upset, realizing that they are not welcome here. And so it went on for all 3 years. Sangul stands uncertainly in front of the brown doors of Class F, his hands clenched into fists, and I hesitate to enter. He looks downcast, realizing that this is a class forged by desperate classmates who have lost any hope due to discrimination in the academy. He opens the door slowly, but he does enter the classroom and sees a teacher with blonde hair, wearing a blue shirt and a black suit, leaning on the table with a rocket launcher-like device in his left hand. Across from him, students sit with their hands raised. When you don't understand what's going on, Sangul gets up in a stupor. The teacher, standing near the blackboard with his device in his hands, distracted by it, casually waves his index finger at him, saying that the headman in his person has finally appeared and invites him to sit down in his place. Sangul falls into a stupor when he sees in front of him a picture of students raising their hands in fear because of the adjustment of the teacher in his hands. He doesn't understand what's going on here, and he looks genuinely puzzled. The teacher, however, does not pay attention to his reaction, and for the second time invites him to sit down in his seat or, if he wants, he can stay where he is. The teacher, after waiting for all the students to gather in the classroom, begins his performance. His name is Kohan Choi, and as of today, he is their homeroom teacher. The blonde man pushed up his glasses, leaning his weapon on his shoulder as he introduced himself to the class. With a conspiratorial grin on his face, Kohan Choi tells his students that today's extracurricular activity is the abduction of the president. Kohan Choi is driving a car with dark glasses and talking to someone who is genuinely surprised to be assigned an F class. As Kohan Choi drives past the academy, an acquaintance of the teacher exclaims that this is crazy and that with his friend's skills, he is supposed to be at least grade A. Kohan Choi looks less excited, picking his right ear and continuing to drive without showing any bright emotions at the words of his friend. He, on the contrary, says that he should keep his flattery to himself and prepare everything as they agreed last time. The teacher's friend sounds agitated, asking if he is planning to organize an anti-government rally. Kohan Choi's eyes light up blue, forming patterns, and his gaze becomes focused on Sangul's back as he continues on his way as if nothing has happened. The teacher slyly grins, continuing to watch him tell their friend that they are going on a small excursion. It shows a cartoon drawing of the academy with teacher Kohan Choi in the background and an explosion behind him. He held up his grenade launcher, enjoying the chaos around him. Below him are his students from Class F, who are obviously not as happy about what has happened as he is. They clearly didn't want to sign up for something like this, exclaiming, "Oh no." Starting today, the F class consisting of complete losers has been assigned a new leader, Kohan Choi. Sangul is still puzzled, asking what's going on here. A student with dark short hair, grinning and leaning on her arm, is clearly dissatisfied with the teacher's behavior and, unlike other students, does not raise their hands in fear. She asks if this is just another useless exercise, and if it's a joke, it's a bad one. The other students start picking up on her words, saying that it must all be a joke and that he, their teacher, must be just having fun, noting that he even brought his fake gun, feeling sorry for him. Kohan Choi stood silently, leaning on the blackboard and crossing his arms over his chest as he listened to his students' words. Looking up at them seriously, he asked them if they really thought he was joking. The teacher launched his weapon, surrounding the entire classroom with green and purple smoke. Kohan Choi says that this is his superpower, the boy who screamed wolves. If they inhaled that smoke, no one would believe a word they said. The students began coughing and choking on the smoke, covering their mouths and noses with their hands, trying not to inhale the contents. Sangul coughed too, covering his mouth with his hand. The teacher continued to talk about his ability, noting that the smoke does not affect those who inhaled it, and that they are all, that is, classmates, the only people who will believe what they say about what happened. Students frantically pulled out their red phones and began typing on the screen, trying to call for help from outside. The teacher, noticing this, immediately shot the phones of two students, red-haired twin boys, with colored white and pink crayons. One of them flew past Sangul, causing him to be very surprised. Kohan Choi will continue his speech, telling them to be a little more serious and listen to their teacher if they don't want to be liars for the rest of their lives. After school, all the students went to the cafeteria. Sangul stuffed his mouth with a huge sandwich, waving his hand and sharing his opinion that he couldn't believe they had a blackmailing psychopathic teacher. Taehyuk Woo walked past him with his hands full of food. Sangul's classmates, then Na Volos and a girl with long dark hair and a blonde guy did not share his fierce surprise. They had more important questions. The girl was asking the dark-haired guy if he loved her. Her friend put his fingers to his temples and tensed as he began to activate his ability. The blonde guy to their left, however, didn't share much enthusiasm, munching on an ice cream cone and honestly sharing his opinion that he was willing to bet the answer was no. The dark-haired guy activated his ability, asking if human, the dark-haired girl's love was reciprocated. Sparks erupted around the boy, bright radiant eyes lit up above his head, and the atmosphere around him changed. The ability of a given guy, Wonchik-gu, to choose between two answers that are correct. Two symbols appeared in front of it, a cross and a circle. The weakness of his ability was that he couldn't answer if there were more than two possible answers. Therefore, the girl's question remained unanswered. A contrite human turned away from her classmates, burying her hands in her hair and crying bitterly. Surprised, Sangul and the indifferent blonde guy who continued to just eat ice cream summed up that love ended before it even started. Sangul realized that no one was taking the teacher seriously. He looked surprised and relaxed at the same time. They were distracted from their work in the school cafeteria when they heard the latest news on the wall-mounted TV. In the live broadcast, it was said that from the center of the city, superheroes began to act. Two men in a light-colored uniform, blonde hair and short hair with green hair, landed in the center of the city next to the robbers to stop them. Not far away, 3 hostages were tied up and tied to a pole, and the black-masked robber looked scared and surprised. The person who conducted the live broadcast happily noted that this was expected from the strongest team of superheroes. The bank robbers got what they deserved, all thanks to a quadra. The host noted that their elected prime minister was previously a member of the same quadra. A statuesque man in a business black suit with dark, short hair was standing in front of the bleachers, talking into a microphone in the spotlight from the cameras. This person was the prime minister and the first superhero prime minister. Under his leadership, the Aquadra elite was assigned to the Presidential Security Service. Against the clear blue sky, 4 men in light uniforms flew by. A blonde man, a man with long dark hair tied back in a ponytail, a red-haired man with a ponytail, and a man with glasses with green hair. These people were members of this Aquadra, a non-profit organization founded by people from the A-Class Leadership Academy. When people say superheroes, they mean them. Sangul looks at the TV screen with awe and admiration, saying that they deserve it. After all, they protect citizens with their superpowers. Sangul's mood immediately changes, clouding everything in dark colors, realizing that now they are not only the protection of citizens, but also the president, and at the moment they cannot compare with such people. Other students appeared in the cafeteria, and when they noticed that the F-grade students were looking at the TV screens with admiration, 3 A-grade students, a fair-haired man, a taller man with long brown hair tied in a ponytail, and a short-haired man, began to make fun of their behavior, saying that they almost didn't know what was going on. Drooling at the men depicted on the screen, saying that the A-class is the best and the A-frame is the best of the best. The blonde-haired man crosses his arms and continues in his speech in a mocking tone, saying that if they want, he can get an autograph, and it's better to ask him than his elders, because they are useless, poor pieces of garbage. Coming closer to Sangul, he tapped him mockingly on the shoulder. He continued his visual speech, saying that they are not even shown on TV. After a second I thought that, on the contrary, they were just shown, because they were reduced to pathetic criminals, losers who get what they deserve from the police. Heroes. Unable to listen to such insults any further, one of the students, a dark-haired boy with green eyes, jumped up in indignation, pushing his chair away from him and snapping at the sarcastic blonde man, asking him to repeat what he had just said. The blonde guy who insults them is named Hasan Yoon and is an A-grade student, surrounded by calculated numbers. His superpower is to predict the development of events and actions. After calculating what would happen after his actions and words, Hasan Yoon managed to dodge the outraged student's punch in time. He tried to punch him in the face, but to no avail. The blow missed and the student fell down, falling to the floor of the dining room. Hasan Yoon only laughed arrogantly at him, saying that it was predictable and that he was no match for A-class. They are completely on different levels. Sangul walked over to the collapsed student named Choan, taking out a napkin from his pocket and looking flustered. He wanted to help him up and wipe the boy's blood from his nose. Joan propped himself up on his knees, wiping the blood running from his nose. He thanked the guy for his kindness. There were only 2 classes in this school. The majority of those who enter the A-class are enrolled. The very fact of having superpowers makes a person special, so being assigned to a class is just a confirmation of their exclusivity. 2 kids from behind the classroom, Hasan Yoon and another dark-haired boy with haughty faces, turned around and started to leave the school cafeteria, saying that they were all losers. It's clear from their expressions that they're not sorry at all. Class F student Aji Yan walked up to the other guy and handed him a cigarette butt, telling him to throw it away. Aji Yan's superpower was that he could turn any garbage into a cigarette butt. Hasan Yoon laughed at him, saying that he could keep the cigarette butt because it was the right place for him. Joan, who was standing next to him, snickered, not expecting such an attack from Hasan. If your superpower was useless, then you were in F class. The other two students from class F, two red-haired boys with displeased faces, were discussing the other class's students who had just left, saying that they were constantly trying to ruin their lives and that their crazy teacher had joined them. One of the two students talking about what happened was Kyuyum, and his superpower was that he could charge his phone up to 3%. Of the two of them, he looked the most displeased, leaning on a chair and throwing his hands behind his head, sighing with displeasure. Sitting next to him was a boy named Yoonkyun Chan, and his superpower was the ability to pick up cell phone service anywhere. He was also lamenting what had happened, leaning on the table and burying a hand in his hair. Not far from them were other students, and one of them was a girl with short brown hair named Woo Ju-ha, and her ability was that when she says UFO, people turn around. Using her ability, she took a bite of ice cream from her classmate who was sitting next to her. Such a description of the ability, and the students made it perfectly clear who they were. Two other students were discussing how one of them didn't have to be a superhero because the only person he wanted to protect was Natsu Chan, an anime action figure. Odin, who was standing next to him, however, did not share his delight, saying that his classmate was stupid. Sangul sat there in disbelief, a look of obvious shock on his face as he watched the entire huge situation from the sidelines. People couldn't believe that they would kidnap the president, because people from a class would have a better chance than them, people from F class. While Sangul was sitting in disbelief and listening to everything that had happened, a classmate came up to him, whispering in his ear that he shouldn't worry. This was Chinsu Lai. His superpower was that his hair would change color when failure was imminent. It's a bumpy guy with long hair falling over his face. His whole appearance looked rather shabby, his shirt was out, and he was chewing on a thumbnail. He noted that his hair hadn't changed color, so everything was fine so far. Sangul calmed down a little, noting that the teacher was probably just joking, believing the idea that they finally had a class teacher with steel balls. Distracting himself from the problem, he took out a gray phone and began to dial the police, intending to hand over the escaped terrorist. Sangul finds himself on a dark bus, and it's already dark outside. Next to him is Hwang Choi, his teacher, and other students. They went on with their business after all. They stopped in front of a two-story house with trees planted around it and a South Korean flag hanging to the right. The teacher got off the bus, holding up a finger and preparing for the adventure that he had originally planned, kidnapping the president. The students protested in horror. I understand that this is really the blue house of the president. Hwang Choi addressed the panicked students, saying that no one will help them and that they may not even try to call the police, reminding them of how his power works. No one will believe them except themselves, the boys and girls who cried wolves. The students clearly look like holes. I understand that nothing will really help them, and they will have to go along with the idea of their crazy teacher. Some students standing nearby began to discuss the situation, asking each other if they had already tried to call the police. Just as the teacher said, no one believed them. The police and other people they contacted thought it was all a hoax. Some of them were told to stop smoking at school, or they hung up without even listening. Standing in one crowd in front of the president's house, the entire class knew that no one would really believe them, and the crazy teacher was right. Whatever they say, they will be considered liars, and their words will be considered a stupid lie or a practical joke. Interrupting the non-student discussion, Hwang Choi began to drag the students onto the bus one by one. Grabbing Sangul's shoulder, he unceremoniously kicked him in the direction of the bus, pushing him inside. They tried to call for help, but no one believed that the F class had been abducted by an armed terrorist. The broken-hearted students, realizing that everything was hopeless and there was nothing waiting for them and no one to save them from the crazy teacher, drooped. Hwang Choi, without much pity for the suffering of his students, told them to move because they had to make it before the security increased. The teacher picked at his ear without much initiative or interest, waiting for all the students to sit down. Sangul was at a loss as to what he should do now, since he was a class leader and one of his duties was to protect his own class. It was already deep into the night, and the stars were visible, and the moon was high in the sky. The students still had no idea what they were signed up for and what awaits them next, how bad things really will turn out. Hwang Choi, standing in front of the students with his smoke gun, waited for the students, excited and not knowing what to do. Only Sangul had the courage to step forward in front of him like a class leader. He turned to the teacher standing in front of him. I honestly admit that he has no idea what happened between him and the president, explaining that they will only get in the way of his feet. He promised that they would stay away from the police. The boy looked flustered enough to be wary of what his teacher's reaction would be. However, Hwang Choi was obviously not overly good-natured as he held up his weapon to Sangul's forehead. There was rage and anger on his face, and he took aim, ready to shoot. His eyes lit up with fire. He spoke to the guy in front of him, telling him that he would go first. The students were shocked by the outcome, Wu Juha decided to come to the rescue in her old age, using her ability to distract her by saying, "Look, UFO." Wang Choi, who quickly read his student's actions, covered her mouth with his hand in time, while still holding the weapon directly against Sangle's forehead. Wu Juha was shocked, but the teacher praised her for her bravery, saying that her elders should still listen to her. Turning to all the students, he added, "Their powers won't work on him." His face expressed confidence in his words, which made the stunned students understand that any attempts would be useless. Sangle was sure of the seriousness of the teacher's words. They continued to stand in front of the bus, the teacher's weapon against his head, and Sangle with his hands raised and not moving. The other students retreated back to where they were before. A dumbfounded Wu Juha was being comforted by a classmate nearby. After getting back to business and dealing with the rebellious part of the class, Wang Choi began to push the kids back to the bus, not forgetting to urge them on with the weapons he always kept ready. The class crowded together and hurried back to get equipment from the teacher's bag and a change of clothes. While the whole crowd led by the teacher was leaving, there was a silhouette of a man standing on the roof of the bus, watching them. Next to him on the left, a golden ram spirit stood still, emitting a glow. A huge moon glows in the night, starry sky. The silhouette still stands motionless next to its spiritual companion as the teacher continues to urge Sangle and the classmate to hurry up. Sensing someone's presence, Wang Choi turns around, looking over his shoulder, but the silhouette standing on the roof of the bus is no longer there. The teacher decides that he imagined it, and it was just the sound of the wind, blaming everything on the fact that the nerves and experiences of the children spread to him, which made him nervous himself. In front of the president's two-story house, the F-class guys are depicted. As before, they still don't have any enthusiasm for the whole idea on their faces. Students of the class will have to break into the Blue House. Will they be able to kidnap the Korean president? Wang Choi decided to investigate the situation by taking out a pair of binoculars prepared in advance and concludes that the security guards are busy preparing for tomorrow's event and they can pass through the east entrance. He still held the gun to the back of Sangle's head, hoping that the teacher would still remove the gun from his head. Behind the two of them, Wonchiku is shedding tears, hugging himself tightly. The guys start complaining again about whether they are really going to kidnap the president. After all, this is not fair, since in this situation they themselves are abducted by their teacher. The purple-haired guy is starting to worry that he should have left his favorite Natsu-chan figurine at home. Sangle, trying to defuse the situation, tries to calm the guys down, but this does not help at all. Standing nearby, Aji Yan, Yuman, and their blue-haired classmate all looked puzzled, their expressions clearly displeased. Aji Yan, who was turning a piece of trash into a cigarette butt, was the first to speak up, asking what they were going to do next since the teacher had already dragged them to the Blue House in the middle of the night. The most and only enthusiastic teacher, with a smile on his face, replied that the plan was quite simple. They go in and grab the president. Wang Choi drew an image of the white-haired president wrapped in rope and begging to be saved from the terrorists. Sangle had no idea how they were going to pull off this operation. The teacher, continuing to poke the poor guy in the back with his weapon, with the same smile on his face, ordered him to move, because he was in charge and should lead the team. Sangle genuinely didn't understand what exactly he wanted from him, looking confused with his hands up. The classmates standing nearby sincerely felt sorry for poor Sangle, knowing that the teacher wanted to push everything on him. Realizing that he doesn't have much choice, Sangle agrees to do everything, but first they all need to calm down. Under the night sky, several men stand in front of the president's house, security guards in white uniforms in a single row. Plan was that there was no plan at all. The poor students hid in the bushes, peeking out of them, but they didn't look particularly happy. Some of them had tears streaming down their faces, and Aji Yan and Sangle just looked bewildered. They knew they had no chance at all. One of the guards yawned tiredly, holding the brim of his cap, lifting it and stretching. He looks very tired, complaining that he would like to sleep now. Students passing by in the bushes tried not to make too much noise, sneaking past the guard on tiptoe. One of the guys, without looking at the ground, stepped on a branch, which caused a crunch to be heard. A nearby security guard heard this, turning around at the sound of the noise, asking what it was. Startled, Sangle and Yuman fell silent. Yuman nervously chewed on her fist, and Sangle's face showed shock that they had already been caught. The guard took out a walkie-talkie and began to announce to the others that there were intruders at the gate, but did not have time to finish what he had started. Their teacher, Wang Choi, came to their aid, using his weapon to shoot the guard who was making a fuss, saying that people had raised the alarm and they needed to get inside as soon as possible. Startled, the students quickly ran to the door of the house as they had no other choice. Their legs were numb and they were shaking with fear, but they kept running. Two guards rushed out to meet them, one of them already loading his gun, while the other looked in shock at the crowd running towards them. The terrified students did not understand what else they could do in this situation and what else they wanted from them. Sangul recalled a situation from the past when he was handed a Class F badge while the other students were whispering among themselves that he must have a very lame superpower since Sangul was assigned to this class. Unlike students in the parallel class, they were treated with prejudice, and many employers even refused to take them on an internship because they represented the F class. The people around them were judging and laughing at them, standing on the sidelines while Sangul stood alone in the distance. He recalled the mocking words from earlier about what happens when F-grade students try to suck up to A-grade students. Pursing his lips tightly, Sangul's expression darkened as he realized that they were from F class, and F meant that they were losers, and there was nothing to be done about it at all. While he was thinking, Yoongi Jo, a guy with glasses and blue hair, suddenly appeared in front of him. This was another classmate of his, and his ability was to muffle the sound around him. Yoongi Jo held out his hand in front of him to protect the boys, and sound waves poured out of his hand. The ability affected two of the guards, making them unable to hear themselves or what was being said. One of them covered his ears, not understanding what was going on, while the other tried to say something into the walkie-talkie, realizing that he wasn't making a sound. A voice from the walkie-talkie demanded to know what was going on. The students happily praised Yoongi Jo, saying that it would shut them up. Relieved that they would be able to get away, the boys rushed past the guards as they silently tried to say something and stop them, holding out their hands in their direction. Yoongi Jo was surprised by the result himself, never thinking that his power could be so useful. He only used it when he was studying at the library. Two other guards rushed out to meet the guys. Both of them pulled out their weapons and pointed them at the guys. They ordered them to stop immediately. Not expecting any other guards to appear in front of them, Woo Joo-ha used her distraction ability, exclaiming that she had seen a UFO. The three guards, succumbing to her ability, turned as if spellbound to follow the direction of the girl's finger. Taking advantage of the distraction of the guards, they immediately rushed to run, but Sangul accidentally fell under the power of a classmate, leaning on a friend. The man tried to bring him to his senses by shaking him and telling him that it wasn't meant for him. The students sped off again, proud of themselves. They couldn't believe they were doing it. After running a short distance, they came across multi-story buildings surrounded by three forks, left, right, and forward. Once Chik-gu used his ability to choose the right answer, he was able to point out exactly where they needed to run to. Sangul rejoiced, realizing that even though everyone called them losers, even they were capable of something by working together. The happy guy beamed, continuing to run after his friends. Teacher Hwang Choi grinned in satisfaction. The guys finally reached the right place, finding themselves in the alley opposite the building's doors. Many of them were exhausted, leaning against the wall and catching their breath. Some were sitting near the entrance, trying to catch their breath. Sangul also buried his hands in his knees, breathing deeply. Standing in the middle of them, the teacher noted that they somehow managed to break away. The boys' hearts were pounding loudly. Despite how hard it was, they enjoyed it. They even surpassed themselves, considering that this was their first time using abilities in practice. Not far from them was the presidential building. Pointing to it, Hwang Choi said that they were already very close. Sangul still couldn't quite believe what they were doing and asked if they were really going to take the president hostage. Removing his dark glasses, the teacher told him not to worry. In their country, juvenile delinquents usually get off with minor punishments. The teacher's words didn't make him particularly happy, and he added outrageously that this wasn't what he meant. Hwang Choi didn't add anything, but concluded that with less words, more action, it was too late to back down. He praised the boys, noting that the guards couldn't even touch them. Even though they were all F-class, they were still superhumans, and ordinary people were far away from them. Touched by the teacher's words, the children lit up with determination. Their cheeks flushed a little. Sangul furrowed his brows, full of confidence. With a smile on his face, Hwang Choi noted that the A-class guards were currently elsewhere, and this was their chance. He was confident that they would kidnap the president and get out unscathed. Jinsu Lee was standing behind Sangul, the tips of his hair starting to change color to pink, indicating that they might fail. Jinsu Lee silently turned to look at the boys with horror in his eyes, saying nothing as his hair began to turn pink faster and faster. The next moment, there was a massive explosion behind the teacher. A black car flew out of the sky, hitting the asphalt with a crash. The two shocked people nearby staggered back, not understanding what was happening. Hwang Choi looked up as a car with a man standing on it flew towards them. It was a man in a white uniform who was addressing the boys. He noted with displeasure that he had only had time to doze off, and why in their time all criminals work at night. Because of people like them, he works overtime and does not get enough sleep at all. Sangul and the other kids looked up, startled by what was in front of them. A man wrapped in a blanket was looking down at them, raising several cars above their heads with his magic. A blonde-haired man with green eyes addressed them, asking what brought them to the Blue House at such a late hour. It was the head of the Presidential Security Service and an Aquadra member named Sion. Sangul stared at him, remembering that he seemed to have seen the man on TV. The Xian, however, wasn't as interested in them as they were, continuing to rub his left eye with his finger. Yunkyun-chan recognized the man and the fact that he was an Aquadra representative, pointing at the sky in amazement and noting that someone like him would definitely take out their teacher in no time. Not far from him, Wang Choi frowned in displeasure at his words. Another girl in the class, Yuman, put her hands to her mouth and tearfully begged for help, saying that they were being held hostage by a terrorist who had abducted them and forced them here. The Xian, interested in her words, rubbed his chin, saying that being kidnapped didn't sound like much. However, he didn't believe her, waving his finger from side to side and noting that any terrorist would start talking like that if they were caught. A disgruntled Yuman continued to claim that it wasn't a hoax and that she wasn't lying. Taking out his phone, Xian began to dial a number, suggesting that everyone gathered in this case just go to the station, where they will have plenty of time to listen to their testimony. Without listening to the blonde guy's speech, Wang Choi took out his gun, glaring at him viciously, and fired several times without warning. The startled students couldn't believe what had happened, and Sangul was sure that the teacher had shot the man. Clouds of smoke from the gunfire obscured the full picture. Wang Choi stared with a murderous look, his brow furrowed. The Xian's eyes glowed with a light green, turquoise light. Several bullets stopped near his face, aimed directly at him. With a clang, several pieces fell to the ground. The Xian, recognizing the man in front of him, addressed him as Mr. Kohan, asking what he was doing here. His face was calm, unlike Wang Choi, who was glaring back at him angrily. The guys who didn't understand anything started talking among themselves. Joan and Yuman were leaning close to each other as they whispered, realizing that they probably knew each other. The Xian hanging in midair and Wang Choi standing on the wreckage in front of him exchanged glances as they continued their conversation. The blonde man frowned slightly, closing his eyes, and added that it was all clear to him now. The presence of Wang Choi meant that the assassination attempt on the president was real. The Xian made a sad face, noting that he was sorry and that the person he knew was a good teacher. He couldn't understand how a man like Wang Choi had come to live like this. The man turned to him with this question. Sangul was standing behind the teacher, a puzzled expression on his face. Despite the soaring man's polite tone, Wang Choi replied in a more rude manner that he just wanted to yap, and he wasn't his teacher, only F-grade kids had the right to call him that. With a sneer and a raised hand, the Xian noted that a real teacher would not involve his own students in treason, or even attempt it. Clenching his fist, the man raised several machines above his head. His ability was psychokinesis, the ability to control any object in sight. With the same smile on his face, Xian added that even an attempted coup is punishable by capital punishment. The man noticed that one of the cars he picked up was the minister's car, and that it would be better to land it carefully in its place, otherwise they might cut his salary for it. He slowly lowered the car to the ground while the others remained floating in the air. The students had already resigned themselves to their fate beforehand, ready for the fact that they were all about to be killed. Wonchiku clenched his hands into fists and yelled that he didn't have the right to punish them since they hadn't committed any serious crimes. Aji Yan, who was standing next to the guy, was already prepared to resist, striking a pose and readying his fists. The Xian, still with the same calm expression and tone, was surprised that they were actually going to fight back. A bunch of losers against one of the strongest heroes. To fight with him with the help of their superpowers is the same as coming with a knife to a shootout. But even so, they already knew that if they tried, they would be capable of something. If they rally together, they will have a chance even against an Aquadra member. Before he could do anything else, the Xian was already at Wonchiku and Aji Yan's side, both of his arms wrapped around their shoulders. Two cars hovered above the man. He already knew and saw their superpowers through the surveillance cameras, and to him, these were just cute tricks. The startled boys didn't have time to say anything, as at the snap of the man's fingers, one of the cars immediately flew at them. Aji Yan pushed his classmate away, and just as they bounced off the car flying from above, they still managed to get hit a little. Saddened, the Xian noted that this is also not easy for him, but he has responsibilities that need to be fulfilled, and he still has to restrain himself since they are all minors. He could not fight at full strength for fear of scandals that he exceeded his authority. Changing from a sad grimace to a soft smile, the man waved his hand up, and at his command, several cars flew into the air again. The Xian said that he was still a little sleepy, so he didn't have to answer for himself. If he missed, they would all be killed, of course, by pure chance. Startled, Sangul stared at everything with wide eyes and open mouth. He was sure that they were all finished. They couldn't provide anything against this monster. While the guy was thinking, suddenly there was another deafening explosion above the building. Sangul squeezed his eyes shut, hunched over and covering his head with his hands. Opening his eyes, he saw in front of him the same guy to whom he had given a gift the day before. It was a class Qek Wu, a big, healthy guy with dark hair. He was holding a car that was about to fall on Sangul. Qek Wu's superpower was superhuman strength. The spirit of a golden ram appeared above him. The Sion was genuinely surprised not to notice that the car in Sangul that had been flying a second ago was already flying in his direction. Not having time to dodge, the man collapsed to the ground, leaning against the wall of the building. Looking up, the Sion saw a trail stretching towards him, left on the ground. The boys had already escaped. Brushing the dust off the shoulders of his suit, the Sion wondered if the guy who had attacked him was also from F class. The moon was high in the black starry sky, and the boys were panting as they ran down the road. When they were sure that they had lost them, they stopped to catch their breath on the path. Many of them were exhausted. Wu Juha collapsed on the ground, trying to catch her breath and complaining that she was going to throw up, while Sangul propped himself up on his feet, taking a deep breath. Huek Wu stood next to them, looking at the poor kids. Sangul thanked the guy for truly saving their skins. He remembered that he was the same class guy that he had run into earlier this morning. Huek Wu stared at him in silence as he asked how he found them. He said he just saw the teacher pushing them onto the bus, so he followed them on his bike. Huek Wu rides his bike along with the bus, his eyes blazing. The guys were surprised how he managed to follow the bus on a bicycle. H. Wang Choi stood nearby, thinking that he didn't think the class student would interfere. The expression on his face was not very pleased, a gloomy expression. Deciding to put things in a more favorable direction, the teacher approached Sangul, putting his arm around his shoulder and asking him to at least smile. Otherwise he would completely intimidate the guy, and now they have a surprise tour and everyone is having a lot of fun. Sangul glared at the teacher, asking him to leave with a glare, while Kayak Wu stood nearby with a murderous look. Seizing the teacher's weapon, Kayak Wu held it tightly in his hand. His face was angry, and the veins on his face were swollen. Not believing the teacher, he asked why he had threatened Sangul with this thing in that case. The children and the teacher were startled and shivered, and H. Wang Choi complained that he actually rented these weapons. Dropping the battered weapon that clattered to the ground, Kayak Wu added that everyone knew about the unsuitable F-class forces for combat. As he blocked Sangul's view of the teacher, he continued to question the teacher with the same incredulity about what he was doing here with these weaklings, asking if he was using them as cannon fodder. The hero appears to save everyone, ready to fight Kayak Wu against the teacher. Will he be able to kick the scoundrel teacher? The next morning, two students from class are walking on a city street, next to a multi-story building and trees blooming nearby, looking at a huge crowd heading somewhere. Hassan Yoon asks a classmate with short black hair who is walking next to him if they are the losers from F class, because they usually don't come this late. With a haughty grin on his face, he answers him, putting his hand to the side, that there should be a separate rule for such garbage to come to the first call. They turned to look at the crowd and told them with smug smiles to come early, otherwise it would make you sick to look at them. The students ignored them, completely exhausted by the events of the previous night. Only their anime classmate, with Natsu-chan on his shoulder, kept a bright look on his face. Sangul just stared at the two guys with a dead stare, his face drawn. After recoiling from the half-dead kids, Hassan Yun and his friend only silently recoiled, not saying anything to them. The short-haired, dark-haired guy only added that they looked darker than usual, wondering what had happened to them. A multi-story building with a red flag of the academy developing against the background. Sangul was exhausted, clutching the straps of his backpack tightly and looking down at his feet. They were all exhausted this morning, and considering what had happened, he wasn't surprised. Sangul goes back to last night, when Kahyuk Woo shielded him from his teacher and asked him what he was doing with them here. The other guys immediately started shouting out that he had dragged them here by force, and Natsu-chan of the purple-haired guy was all scared because of him. Yongkyung-chan added approvingly, pointing a finger at the teacher, that, plus, he also used some strange smoke on them. H. Wang Choi remained the calmest of them all, sticking his hands in his pants and clarifying that it was about his superpower, the boy who screamed wolves. Closing his eyes, the teacher threw something at Sangul, explaining that this was exactly what he had used on them. Catching the thrown thing, the guy ducked a little, seeing that it was an ordinary smoke trap. H. Wang Choi said that he doesn't really have any superpowers that make others think they're lying. Sangul asked with a puzzled expression why no one believed them back then when they started asking others for help. Abruptly changing his mood, the teacher looked down at him with an indifferent expression, replying that just no one cares about such a bunch of losers. The students opened their mouths, not knowing what to say. Sangul stared at him in silence, not expecting such words. He frowned, biting his lower lip. It was like being hit in the back of the head with a sledgehammer. His words completely shattered the guy's confidence in themselves. Even getting out of bed and going to school required considerable effort. The guy continued to walk down the corridor of the building. Last night, the Blue House was attacked by an unknown group of terrorists. To prevent further attacks and increase security, the Blue House issued an official statement announcing the postponement of today's parade by 2 weeks. Sion's face was on the screen of a laptop sitting on the desk, surrounded by papers, supplies, and a printer to the right. At the bottom of the screen was a sign that read "Breaking News" about how the Sion had chased away a group of terrorists. The president is completely safe thanks to the timely intervention of the security service, headed by a Sion from a quadra. Inside the office, H. Wang Choi was slumped in a chair. His feet were on the table, and he was twirling a pen in his right hand while the other was slung around his neck. He said that at least now he would have more time and that it might be worth recruiting a team with better superpowers. Hyuk Woo stood outside the door, his hand clenched tightly into a fist. With a huge bang, the door flew out. Hyuk Woo was standing in the middle of the smoke, looking at his clenched fist. It was a polite knock on the door that got out of hand. Noticing him, the teacher lowered his glasses, arching one eyebrow. The disciple stood right in front of the man, displeasure oozing out of him. Despite how viciously Hyuk Woo was looking at him, he remained completely calm, crossing his legs and casually poking his finger, asking if he wanted to explain why such a great and powerful a class student was poking his nose into the affairs of a pitiful F class. He immediately added that he shouldn't even think about snitching on him. The police and the principal wouldn't believe a student anyway. Hyuk Woo handed the man a white envelope, saying that he wanted to transfer. The teacher raised his head, looking at the contents in his hands. Not believing his words, H. Wang Choi arched an uncomprehending brow. Hyuk Woo folded his arms and frowned, looking down menacingly. He was standing in the middle of Class F. The boys stared at him, not understanding what was happening. All the students had shock on their faces. They immediately started whispering as they recognized the guy. In front of them was a class Hyuk Woo, and they couldn't figure out what the top of class was doing here, whether it was some new kind of bullying. The fearsome guy walked forward through the classroom, stopping next to Sangul's desk. Sangul shrank a little and shook. Hyuk Woo decided to sit next to him, and Sangul couldn't believe it. Hyuk Woo looked gonzo as he looked down at his classmate, causing Sangul to break out in a bit of sweat. But even though he was afraid, he said hello, asking if he wanted to sit down with him. Silently averting his gaze, Hyuk Woo began to pull the red backpack off his shoulders. The neighbor wanted to put away his things, but he didn't have time when Jack Woo's briefcase clattered to the desk, leaving cracks on it. Sangul shook as he looked at the painting in front of him in shock. Hyuk Woo accidentally broke a desk and it fell in two. The classroom immediately fell into a wild silence. A teacher in a black jacket, cap, and camouflage pants strode into the classroom with a stick slung over his shoulder. Turning to Hyuk Woo, he told him to try not to overdo it with force, because here in the F class, there is no super strong, state-of-the-art equipment, and because of this, everything breaks easily. Kim Young and Yeonhee Jo, who weren't too happy about teacher's appearance, looked a little gloomy. Kyu Young looked disinterested, leaning his hand on the desk, while Yeonhee Jo looked at the teacher uncertainly from under his brows. They wondered what he was going to make them do today. I wish I had a normal lesson for once. Maybe math or literature. The very idea of what the teacher had prepared for them was disturbing. H. Wang Choi glanced at the kids, noticing their textbooks on their desks and telling them to put them away. Sangul slowly put the textbook back in his briefcase, concluding that this was going to be another day of misadventure. Next to him, Hyuk Woo was huddled up with a briefcase in his hands. The teacher added that they should change into sports uniforms. The entire class looked at the teacher as he explained what they were going to do. They have a superpowers training class today. He will assess their progress at the presidential parade in 2 weeks' time, and he expects at least some progress from each of them. Before the teacher could finish speaking, the dark-haired girl jumped up, slamming her hand on the table. Her expression was clearly displeased. She frowned, adding that they were F class, and they didn't have any superpowers that could be trained at all, and what could they even do with their stupid abilities? Hyuk Woo glanced back at the outraged girl, noting that superpowers training was part of the general training program. Sangul smiled awkwardly as he recalled the past training sessions. They had once had them, but the teacher saw how useless they were and just left. Sangul used a firecracker while the gloomy teacher silently turned around and left. H. Wang Choi ignored the students' complaints and said that you are who you think you are and they would still be a bunch of losers if they continued to think of themselves that way. H. Wang Choi ruffled his hair, closing his eyes and frowning a little. They themselves saw the proof of his words yesterday. Sion abruptly appeared next to the two boys, wrapping his arms around their shoulders. They were treated as if they belonged in the trash. People pointed at them and laughed. Wasn't it time to change something? The teacher smiled and continued. He had seen what they were capable of yesterday. It was time for them to become stronger so that they could gain real strength over time. H. Wang Choi was sure of it. Sangul, however, did not share his opinion. He asked why he was sure. With a grim expression, Sangul added that there was no confirmation of his words. How could he confirm his words? Chuckling at his words, H. Wang Choi pushed up his glasses. Above the blackboard was a sign that read, "I'm a teacher, you're not." A second later, the board lifted, revealing the hidden wall beneath. On the wall were multiple awards, diplomas, medals, certificate of distinction of the Institute of Elite Forces. The children looked with admiration at the awards posted on the wall, amazed at their number. It couldn't be true. More than half of all the class students studied there before coming here. It was the best academy for superhumans in the entire country. The boys continued to admire the awards with their mouths open, their eyes sparkling. They now knew who H. Wang Choi was. He said that to them. He was probably some random terrorist targeting the president, but as far as training superheroes was concerned, he would be the best in the world. Sitting down on the teacher's desk and crossing his legs, H. Wang Choi asked them who they thought would help them more, him or the president. With a smile, H. Wang Choi held out his hands. An apple tree bloomed in them. The master has ordered them to do as he says for the next 2 weeks, and then they will reap the golden fruits of their labors. Bright, richly decorated room. On the table is a lot of sweets, next to them a bouquet of fresh roses, a tea set and a bell. On the big bed in his pink pajamas, the president held a pillow close to him and looked at the Sion. The wall to the president's bedroom was crushed. Sion greeted the president with a good morning while he wondered what had happened to his bedroom. The Sion beamed at him, his face beaming. He told him not to worry and that a bunch of terrorists tried to kidnap him yesterday, nothing unusual at all. The president exclaimed how he cannot worry and how in such a situation you can remain calm, and where the criminals were now, whether he caught them. The man continued to smile radiantly in response, replying that they had unfortunately managed to leave. Folding his hands behind his back, the Sion added, "He can rest assured that under the protection of a squadra, no one will lay a finger on him." H. Wang Choi held up the blue ice cream in the shape of a small hand. The teacher told them not to worry. Under his guidance, they would be able to kidnap the president. While eating the ice cream, he added that if they trained for the next 2 weeks. However, their goal wasn't to kidnap the president, it was H. Wang Choi's goal, not theirs. Jungkyung Chan raised his hand, asking where exactly the training sessions would be held, since F-class is not allowed to use the gym. With a smirk, H. Wang Choi told them not to worry, and he had already called the right person for help. The door to the office opened and a silhouette appeared. It was a man in a black robe, with a cross around his neck. He had long, black hair and black eyes, and had a white patch on his forehead. He was carrying a red-sheathed instrument on his back. The stranger apologized for the delay, explaining that he was late because of the service. Sangul was surprised to mistake the man for a priest or a metalworker in a cassock. The dark-haired man stood next to H. Wang Choi and, to the surprised guesses, replied that the first option was correct and that he was trained by H. Wang Choi's under-teacher. After hearing his words, Sangul concluded that he definitely looked more like a black metalhead. Pulling out a cross, the man held it tightly in his hand and replied that black metal is the music of Satan, which corrupts souls. There was a holy aura around him, bright lights and little angels flying around. H. Wang Choi wrapped his arms around the boy, patting him on the shoulder and introducing him to the boys. His name was Won Rakyung, and his superpower was dimensional creation. It represents space in your head, and voila, a pocket dimension, but pocket dimensions are too small to really count as separate dimensions. Won Rakyung was in dark weightlessness, surrounded by bodies as a light blue glow emerged from his chest. H. Wang Choi added that such power can be dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands. For example, a supervillain with such power could secretly lock someone up in a pocket dimension or create a secret laboratory for human experiments. Smiling, H. Wang Choi pointed an ice cream cone in Won Rakyung's direction. He stood with the cross in his hands, kissing it. The teacher explained that unlike the others, he was a good guy, and at worst he would create a secret confessional. Won Rakyung confirmed the teacher's words that he really promised to use his power only for good. Sangul immediately conjured up an image of Won Rakyung as an evil metalhead playing an electric guitar. Raising his hand uncertainly, Sangul asked him exactly where he placed his pocket dimensions. Walking over to Sangul's desk, Won Rakyung crouched down and handed the boy a small golden ice cream stick, asking him to hold it. The boy hesitantly held out his arms in response, wrapping them around him from both sides. Won Rakyung explained that this lollipop is the key. The lollipop was shaped like a beer mug with foam on top of it. Sangul had to bite him when he wanted to enter. He, not quite sure how to enter, asked the man how to do it, holding a lollipop in his fingers and looking at it in disbelief. Won Rakyung reached out and wrapped his hand around the one holding the lollipop and pointed it at his chest. Sangul's hand passed through, sinking into the man's body. A golden glow flared up around their junction. With a smile on his face, Won Rakyung held Sangul's shoulder. Pulling it towards him, the guy fell through it, falling into another dimension. A golden net lit up from above, and he flew straight down through it. Sangul screamed as he plopped right into the white space. He fell flat on his face, sprawling on all fours. After him, the other classmates flew in sports uniforms, landing right on top of Sangul. It was Aji Yan and Yuman. Sangul breathed his last as the boys apologized guiltily. The last person to arrive was Hwang Choi, right there with a half-eaten ice cream cone in his hands. When the transfer was completed, they found themselves in what looked like a sports arena. The grandstands, which were enclosed by a ring, the judge's box, located on top, and a huge field for dueling. Sangul didn't immediately realize where they were. The boys looked around, trying to figure out where they were. They were all wearing sports uniforms, and Yuman noticed that she didn't remember them changing into them. Hwang Choi and Won-rak-young were standing next to each other, discussing their difficult landing. Hwang Choi continued to eat the ice cream while a man standing next to him with his hands clenched into fists shared that he felt even worse than Hwang Choi. He would never get used to the feeling of people being sucked in through your body. Throwing his head back to the sky, Won-rak-young smiled and greeted everyone. This was one of his dimensions called Trial Arena. It was actually his personal training area, but Hwang Choi asked him to adapt it to his students. While the guys were looking around, a girl with short blonde hair asked what exactly their training would consist of. Wonchiku added, putting his finger to his chin and thinking that Hwang Choi can just pull the weights and get stronger, but the rest of us can't train superpowers like that. With a smile, Hwang Choi rubbed his chin, telling his students not to worry. He and Won-rak-young took care of everything. The teacher asked who would be the first volunteer, and Yeonhee-jo immediately raised his hand to volunteer. Behind him, his classmates cheered him on, claiming that this was the act of a real man. Yeonhee-cho was the deputy headman. Unlike Sangul, in his opinion, he is reliable and responsible, so usually people trust him with important problems. Yeonhee-jo walked over to the podium that had a red button on it. He wasn't quite sure what to do. The teacher told him to push the button, and he did. The moment he pressed it, a huge iron cage appeared around the disciple. The guy was standing there in disbelief because of what had just happened. Grabbing the bars of the huge cage, which glowed a light blue color, he began to shake it, not understanding what was happening. Not far away, Hwang Choi was casually finishing his ice cream with a smug smile on his face. Won-rak-young, however, didn't share his happy mood, saying that he should treat his students with respect for once. Hwang Choi added that the cage would simply scan his superpowers so that the student wouldn't worry. He had nothing to worry about at all. Won-rak-young leaned over the other two students and asked them if they remembered how they got their superpowers, if they had forgotten about it. Sangul stared at him, his eyes wide, they shone, and a blush appeared on his cheeks. Meanwhile, Yeonhee-jo, who was already drooping, leaned on the button stand and finished his superpowers scan in the cage. He looked lousy. The cell began to create a training ground based on the information it received. She shone, disappearing around Yeonhee-jo just as she had appeared. The guy was standing in the middle of the training stage, a golden glow emanating from him. A small, round robot with a small antenna on its head ran past him. Noticing it, the guy was a little puzzled and asked the teachers what kind of strange bouncing ball it was. Next to him, the little robot giggled viciously, opened its mouth and made a loud, deafening sound. Yeonhee-jo didn't expect this and immediately screamed, blood spurting out of his ears, and the glasses on his face cracked. In a panic, the student began to apply his mute ability, putting his hand forward to the robot and trying to muffle it. As soon as he got one down, a whole lot more of the same small, screaming robots flew out at him. The kids and teachers hurried to cover their ears, but Sangul, like Yeonhee-jo, had blood spurting out of his ears. The little robots immediately clung to the student, screaming and driving him crazy. There were too many of them, and his strength wasn't enough to shut them all up. The boy crouched down, holding his head in his hands. The noise was too much for him, his glasses cracked, and he buried his hands in his hair. The guy screamed loudly at them to shut up. Suddenly, after his shout, there was an incredible silence. All the robots were gone. Hwang Choi praised him. This little training was enough to increase the radius of his power. Hunched over, Yeonhee-jo turned to look at the teacher in disbelief. The teacher added that a great threat awakens a great desire to overcome it, and such hope is the root of any superpower. The stronger the roots, the taller the tree. A huge tree with a strong glow coming from its roots. The goal of this workout is to strengthen the hope that your strength grows from. The teacher added that these are premium class training sessions, and even A-class students don't have easy access to them. They were very lucky to have him as their teacher. Proud of himself, the teacher smiled. Yeonhee-jo, who was sitting on the ground with his elbows on his knees, looked haggard in contrast. After the teacher's words, Won-rak-young added that he was the coach here. The other students were fired up, and Yuman started to contradict herself so that he wouldn't get cocky and they didn't need a terrorist teacher. However, she also wants to practice. The inspired girl raised her fist up, exclaiming, "Sangul, you just watched in silence." He realized that the teacher was right. Hwang Choi didn't lie, and Yeonhee-jo's strength increased after this training session. I wonder what will happen to the others. Yuman's ability was that she could suddenly run into the person she wanted to see. The joyful girl imagined a beautiful mermaid lying on the shore. Aji-yan continued to amuse himself by turning trash into cigarette butts. Sangul was inspired, thinking that maybe it would work on him too. Suddenly, this is the opportunity he's been waiting for all his life. Wang Choi turned to the student with a smile, beckoning him over. Now it was his turn. Sangul was standing in front of the crowd, the teachers, everyone was looking at him. It remains only to go to the stand with the button. Sangul could feel his heart beating hard as he kept his hand on the button. His cheeks were flushed. He pressed the button, thinking that it was better not to get ahead of himself because no one knows what he will face. He was a little scared. Unexpectedly, the button returned an error. The bewildered teacher stared at him, not sure what was going on. Suddenly, the cage descended around the student. Sangul's ability was that he could see birthdays. The teacher's device couldn't find him suitable training. Sangul stared at nothing in horror. Sangul stared at the button. The training session never started. The student was terrified and didn't understand what was happening. He couldn't understand why nothing was happening. He wanted to know at least the reason why there was nothing suitable for him. Another classmate with short dark hair said that the training program can't waste time on someone as flawed as him. That's what it meant. The guy leaned on the stand with the button. The dark-haired classmate's name was Kiju Eom, and her superpower was absolute memory. The only one in their class with a useful ability. She was originally assigned to Class A, but she transferred to their class on her own accord. Why? Like she said, she can't breathe the same air as these freaks. The girl is walking down the corridor alone, throwing out a transfer request sheet. She was a special case. Not like them. The guys standing off to the side looked at her in disbelief. Wang Choi crosses her arms and asks her if she really doesn't want to participate. When he approached his student, she told him that there was nothing wrong with her powers. She just doesn't want those dumb robots testing her. Plus, this training program is not suitable for everyone. Not all powers can be useful in battle. Sangul was standing next to her, staring at her. These last words were especially summed up by her reference to him, hinting that it was about him. Sangul, hearing this, decided that he was probably the biggest loser in their class. The guy visibly drooped. Hyuk-woo, who was standing nearby, stared at him in silence. He started to reach out, but was interrupted. Aji-yan beat the big man to it, telling him not to push. After all, many people here feel useless. Wonchiku scratched his cheek awkwardly and joined in, remembering the blonde guy from a quadra who had blown them all apart. Aji-yan added that even though he's a good fighter, his fists won't help if your enemy can throw cars. His superpower wasn't very useful during the operation either, but despite this setback, he wasn't going to give up just because of it. Shifting his gaze away to Kiju Eom, he added that no one had said a word to her about combat strength that night, despite the fact that her absolute memory ability was completely useless against a Sion. The girl frowned at his words, then spitefully told him not to dare talk to her like she was one of them, because she never wanted to be. Sangul, hunched over, interrupted their argument, asking them not to quarrel with each other. Suddenly his face lit up, his eyes lit up, and his hands clenched into fists. He said that this was the first training session of the F-class superpowers, and they should remember this day. Aji-yan, a little taken aback by this change of mood, turned to his classmate. But the classmate immediately replied not to worry about him, because he didn't expect anything from his strength anyway. Sangul turned his back to leave, telling them to continue while he went to study math. Picking up a golden lollipop, he took a bite out of it. Above his head, a huge exit sign appeared. Turning around, he gave them a final smile, saying that he was very happy for them. In the next second, Sangul left the training area. Rakyung, not knowing what to say, just exhaled heavily. The blue-haired boy and Kiju Eom, who were standing nearby, started talking to each other. The guy was dissatisfied with what had happened, turning to the girl and asking if she was satisfied with what had just happened. The girl, who had her back to him and took out her lollipop shaped like a small human hand, replied that he had actually made a wise choice and that she should also sit down to study. Kiju Eom followed Sangul out of the training dimension. Hyuk-woo, who was standing nearby, looked around in silence. A few kids were playing on the playground. Some of them flew through the air, others used superpowers and stood on the gate, quickly moving their hands. People were rushing through the sky, glittering with different colors. One Sangul was sitting on a bench to the side, watching the game. He indulged in childhood memories of sitting on the sidelines in the same way while the others played. He didn't understand why he was being ignored, since he was also a superhuman. While the little boy sat off to the side, the other kids had fun riding the slide, running, and playing with each other. Sangul was told that this is because people prefer to hang out with those who are slightly better than them. After all, they do not have the courage to provoke those who are much superior to them. The little boy who was sitting alone was hunched over with wet eyes. A man sat down next to him, saying that by doing so, they show their envy only when they get away with it. Sangul recalled the words about being told how superhuman he was, because he was no better than them. They will say this because they cannot bear to see him receive the fruits of his efforts. While the huge lion was returning at the top, the little lion cub was surrounded by ugly monkeys from below. The man who was saying this gently stroked his head, telling him to remember his words. Little Sangal bowed his head under his gentle touch. Sangal's superpower was generated by a strong desire. The man said that this ability proves that he has a sharp mind. Sangal, however, does not agree with him. The boy's jaw tightened. He believed that these words of his father were a lie. Times have changed, and now you can't do everything with your brain alone. Sangal bent over his knees with a lollipop in his hands. While Sangal was thinking about what he was doing, a bracelet suddenly flew at him from behind. The poor guy fell off the bench, holding a colored bracelet between his thumb and forefinger. A little girl ran up to him, demanding to get her bracelet back immediately. The girl waved her small hands indignantly until Sangal handed it back to her. The bracelet fell into the girl's small hand. The little girl smiled happily, saying that her name was Ayan Cho and she was in the 3rd grade. The girl immediately began actively chatting with the guy, while he awkwardly turned away, sitting on the bench. She started asking him if he had superpowers, and how people from his school could do cool things like fly and shoot fire out of their hands. She really wanted to see what he could do. Sangal awkwardly turned away, saying that his superpower has nothing to do with flying or fire. The girl looked at him questioningly as the guy continued to talk about how his superpower was that he could find out when her birthday was, and that was all he was capable of. The little girl said that guessing other people's birthdays sounds pretty boring. This hit Sangal in the heart. The girl continued by saying that she can tell when her dad's birthday is, and asked if that makes her a superhero too. Despite her innocent words, every word she said hit Sangal harder. When the girl was about to leave, the guy completely lost heart. He only came to his senses when Kwak Woo appeared at his side. Sangal was surprised to see him. He asked me what he was doing here. The guy replied that he decided to get out of that dimension because they don't really like training. He sat down next to Sangal. Sangal was surprised that he didn't like training, since he could easily become the strongest hero if he trained his strength. Kwak Woo replied that this is the problem, because he doesn't want to get stronger. Sangal's painting was breaking down. He didn't understand why a person with such power didn't want to become stronger. He replied to Kwak Woo that this was some presumptuous nonsense from someone who had never had to put in a single bit of effort in their life. Kwak Woo stared at him in silence. Sangal continued to push, saying that he didn't even know what the other students in his class were like, how they feel around someone who is so much stronger than them. Sangal shouted the last words angrily when he realized a second later that he had snapped at him. Kwak Woo stood in front of him, looking down and not saying anything. Meanwhile, the teacher was peeking out of the bushes, looking for the children through binoculars. He knew where to start.